Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming this morning. We're going to get started. It looks like we don't have a line downstairs, so we'll go ahead and get started. I do want to note that today this meeting is being webcast, so it's really important that folks speak into the microphone to make sure folks that are listening online are able to hear us today and participate accordingly. So, good morning. I'm Erin Ragazzi with the State Water Resources Control Board, Division of Water Rights. We're here to talk about the cannabis cultivation policy, draft general order, and staff report. And because this microphone doesn't work for me to stand, I'm actually going to sit down with it. So I want to thank you all for coming this morning. A little bit on logistics. If you need to use the restroom during the meeting, feel free to step out the doors. If you go right or left, you'll reach a restroom if you turn left if you go this direction, and right if you turn that direction. So that's logistics. There's also drinking fountains in those locations as well, and a cafe on the first floor. From an emergency standpoint, if we start to see strobe lights light up the sky, then that means we need to exit the building in an orderly fashion and proceed over to Cesar Chavez Park, which is right across the street. If you stick with us, then when we get the all clear, we can all come back and resume the meeting at that time. So I want to do a little bit of introductions this morning. With me today from the Division of Water Rights is Dan Schultz. And Dan will be providing a presentation on the policy and staff report. From the Division of Water Quality, we have Tim O'Brien. Tim's going to be presenting on the draft general order. And from the Office of Chief Counsel, we have Andrew Derringer and Lily Weaver. We also should have some folks out there from our sister agencies. So from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Amber Villalobos is out there. And so if you have questions for what's going on with CDFW and cannabis, she'd be the person to talk to. And then from the California Department of Food and Agriculture, Amber Morris was going to be here this morning. So Amber's back there in the red. So if you have questions for her later, you can stop by and talk with her. And I'm going to see how these slides go. Great. So for folks that are out there or folks that want to find the presentation after today, the presentation is available online on the Water Board's website. We have a cannabis portal at this location. You can find information on all the documents we're going to be talking about today, as well as the regional board programs and the Office of Enforcement's program. So a little bit on logistics today. We're going to have a presentation that covers the draft policy, then the draft general order, say a few words about the small irrigation use registration that we're working on, give you information on who to contact if you have questions when you leave here today, and then we'll get into questions and answers. So the focus of the meeting today is to discuss the three documents and for us to provide information to you about those three documents: the draft general order, the draft policy, and the draft staff report. Now, next Wednesday on August 2nd, we're having a board workshop. The board workshop's purpose is to provide general information, but more importantly, to solicit comments from folks. So here today, we're going to provide you with information, answer your questions. If you want to provide comments, you can do that in writing via the process that's outlined in the notice, or you can come to that August 2nd workshop and provide comments in that forum as well, directly to the board. I'm going to ask that folks silence their electronic devices right now if you haven't done so already. Folks signed in downstairs. The two handouts we had today are a copy of the notice. The notice is what provides information on the meeting today, the meeting on August 2nd, the hearings we'll be conducting on October 17th, the comment deadline that's ending on September 6th, and how to submit comments by that deadline of September 6th. So we've discussed timeline. The big one up there is just making sure that you get your comments in by noon on September 6th so that we can consider them in development of the final policy, staff report, and general order. So our presentation today is going to consist of background, a little bit of how did we end up here today, followed by the Water Board's responsibilities, That's going to get into some of the legislation that led us to develop the policy in general order. Then Dan's going to provide that overview of the policy and staff report. Tim's going to cover the general order, and then we'll wrap up with a little discussion of the small irrigation use. So how did we end up here today? There were a variety of bills that were passed, 3 bills back in 2015, 2 Assembly bills and 1 Senate bill, and that created the basis for the regulation of medical marijuana. And then in 2016, Senate Bill 837 was passed by the legislature, and that included cleanup language for those 3 bills that were passed in 2015, as well as new language saying that the Water Board should develop a policy for water quality control, which is essentially regulations for cannabis cultivation. Prop 64 was passed in November of 2016. That led to the incorporation of adult use of cannabis. And then in June of 2017, so just a month ago, the legislature passed Senate Bill 94, which included cleanup language for all of those medical and commercial cannabis cultivation processes, and established the Municipal and Adult Use Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act. So that's what we're operating under now. So under SB 94, it included a little bit of cleanup language for this provision, and this provision basically just says that the State Water Board and appropriate regional boards shall address discharges of waste associated with cannabis cultivation, including adopting a general permit, and that's what Tim's going to be talking about today. Then SB 837 included a provision that said that the State Water Board, in coordination with the California Department of Food and Agriculture and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, are to ensure that the individual and cumulative effects of cannabis cultivation do not impact the in-stream flows needed for fish spawning, migration, and rearing, and the need to maintain natural flow variability. There was a further provision that said the California Department of Fish and Wildlife was going to consult with the State Water Resources Control Board in the development of a policy for water quality control. And what that policy for water quality control was doing is establishing interim and long-term. So right now we're talking about the interim provisions, but it gives us the ability to do interim and long-term principles and guidelines for cannabis cultivation. Principles and guidelines is a fancy word in the water code for requirements. So basically directing the water board to develop a policy for water quality control. Policy sounds like it's just a policy, not necessarily something that's required, but in the water code, a policy for water quality control is equivalent to a regulation. So what we're talking about here today is that draft policy or regulation that the water board is proposing to address the impacts associated with cannabis cultivation. There were a couple unique provisions associated with Senate Bill 837 in that it said that we need to make sure that the policy includes measures to protect springs, wetlands, and aquatic habitat from negative impacts of cannabis cultivation. And it included a provision that said that the water board can also include requirements related to groundwater extractions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to get into the policy.
Good morning. So my name is Dan Schultz with Division of Water Rights, and so I'll talk about the policy here and the different requirements and components of the policy in the staff report. So first, kind of overarching, the policy for water quality control establishes the requirements for the State Water Board's cannabis regulatory program, and those requirements get incorporated into 3 different programs: the general order, the Small Irrigation Use Registration Program, and California Department of Food and Agriculture's Cal Cannabis Cultivation Licensing Program. So as Aaron mentioned earlier, the focus of this presentation is on the documents that are out for public comment, and that's the draft cannabis policy and staff report. So the policy describes the overall structure of the board's proposed cannabis cultivation regulatory program, water quality, and in-stream flow requirements. And the staff report provides the background information and rationale for the requirements in the policy. The draft cannabis general order includes the tier structure, fee structure, and environmental management plans. So now we'll dive into the policy in a little bit more detail, and we'll work through all the different components of it. So the policy is basically made up of three main components. There's the main document, there's attachment A, which basically houses all the cannabis cultivation requirements, and then attachment B, which is the glossary of terms. So attachment A is highlighted here in green because we just want to point out that the requirements in the policy in attachment A are the equivalent of the requirements that are in the general order. They're basically just incorporated from the policy into attachment A of the general order. The cannabis cultivation policy goes over some of the enforcement components of the policy. Enforcement of the policy requirements will be handled through various water boards authorities, including water rights, water quality, and public trust. The state water board has the primary enforcement responsibilities for the principles and guidelines established through the policy. And then also, it's important to note that appropriate penalties and other consequences for violations prevent cultivators that do not comply with requirements from obtaining an unfair competitive advantage and help ensure public confidence in the regulatory framework. And then as well, existing frameworks or existing enforcement efforts such as the Watershed enforcement team will continue their work as well in the watersheds. So the cannabis cultivation, the main document, provides an overview of Water Board's program and context for how it fits in with the other cannabis regulatory programs. It establishes 14 regions throughout the state for in-stream flow requirements, and it also includes the continuing authority to amend the policy. The policy the legislative directives include the ability for the State Water Board to update the policy as needed over time, as we learn more information about cannabis cultivation activities and the potential impacts. And the main document also describes how the policy will be enforced. And I skipped this slide. So now we'll dive into attachment A of the policy, and we'll start off with section 1. Section 1 is the general requirements and provisions of the policy. And this is basically the rules and authorities, and it applies to all cultivators. And it includes requirements such as right of access for agencies to inspect for compliance, laws about tribal lands and cultural resources, general water quality rules such as riparian setbacks, limitation on slope of land being disturbed, and it includes components of the cannabis general water quality certification. It also includes components that require compliance with all state and local laws, and forest practice rules, state policies and plans. It requires cannabis cultivators to comply with California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Lake and Streambed Alteration Program as well. Section 2 of the cannabis cultivation policy is where the water diversion and waste discharge requirements are located. And many of these requirements in Section 2 are similar to best practical treatment control measures, and they also include BMPs or other standard conditions for the protection of water quality. Here's a list of just some general big picture ones that are included in Attachment 2. I'll just go through them. General erosion control measures for cannabis cultivation site, stream crossings and installation, culverts and road development, management of fertilizers, pesticides, and petroleum, cleanup, restoration, and mitigation on existing slopes or sites, proper soil cultivation and human waste disposal, control of irrigation runoff, and appropriate methods of water diversion and storage, which includes a maximum diversion rate of 10 gallons per minute unless otherwise approved by an existing water right, and winterization. And these requirements were developed in coordination with the California Department, or all these requirements were developed in coordination with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Food and Agriculture, Department of Pesticide Regulation, Division of Water Rights, Division of Water Quality, and other state water board divisions. So Section 3 of the Cannabis Cultivation Policy includes the numeric and narrative in-stream flow requirements. So the narrative in-stream flow requirements, there's a few of them, but the couple highlighted here is that the cannabis cultivators must bypass 50% of stream flow past their point of diversion. This is a visual bypass. It also includes a surface water forbearance period, and that forbearance period, it basically means the period of time that diverters that are diverting from surface water bodies are not allowed to divert water, so they need to have storage to cover the time when they can't divert water. And the forbearance period is from April 1st to October 31st. And the forbearance period is based on the in-stream flows that are available to divert, so there's a couple nuances to it. And so before the diversion season can kick in on November 1st, the in-stream flow has to be above the minimum flow requirement for 7 consecutive days or past the December 15th, whichever occurs first. So in years where there's a wetter year in the earlier winter, diverters will be able to divert earlier. If it's a drier year, they won't be able to divert until those flows kick up or December 15th. And then also on the back end, for the end of the diversion period, that may end prior to April 1st if the flows are not high enough to meet the in-stream flow requirement and allow for diversions. So that folds us into the numeric in-stream flow and gauge requirement components. There are compliance gauges that are listed in the policy, and there are numeric in-stream flow requirements that are associated with those compliance gauges. So there's 2 different components of the in-stream flow requirement. I'll start with the surface water diversion period, and those are all these flow requirements listed in Section 4, which we'll discuss in just a second. But basically, cannabis cultivators will be assigned a gauge to report to, and they'll need to check that gauge prior to diverting to ensure that the flows are above that minimum requirement. Diverters will also be required to measure and record daily water diversion and use. And there's also an inclusion for gauge installation requirements for additional gauges used for compliance with the numeric flow requirement. And there's 3 main components of this. There is basically the way that this works is that the Deputy Director of Division of Water Rights may require cannabis cultivators to install a more localized gauge if it's determined that the localized impacts of cannabis diversion and demand are not being represented by the compliance gauge. The second is we came out with, in general, we're using United States Geologic Survey and California Department of Water Resources, I can never remember the acronym for CDEC, gauges as our compliance gauges to start with. But we recognize that there's more gauges than that are available out there, but we weren't able to check the operation and maintenance and the quality control of those gauges. So a cannabis cultivator may request that we evaluate using a different gauge for them to report to and to use as a compliance gauge. And the third one is that a cannabis cultivator may request, or a group of cannabis cultivators, to install a localized gauge themselves because they don't think that they believe that their demand is less than what's being depicted at the compliance gauge. So there's also groundwater requirements in Section 3. And so also in Section 4 of the compliance gauge, at each compliance gauge are in-stream low flow thresholds. These in-stream low flow thresholds were developed for the dry season. And they're one mechanism that we're using to evaluate whether groundwater diversions are potentially having a negative impact on surface water flow. We are also looking at some other components of groundwater diversions that may have an impact to trigger additional requirements. And so the additional requirements may be having groundwater diverters to also have forbearance periods or take other measures to protect in-stream flows. So the other 2 additional conditions that we're evaluating is if we see a number of surface water diverters in a localized area shifting to groundwater diversions to avoid the surface water flow requirements, that may trigger additional actions on groundwater, and also looking at in areas where we have significant groundwater diversions and significant cannabis cultivation, that might be another situation where we look to develop additional measures for groundwater. There's also measures for fully contained springs. Fully contained springs are springs that do not run off of property in the absence of diversion and do not have surface or subsurface hydrologic connectivity at any time during the year during all water types. So these diverters with fully contained springs may request that the 50% bypass requirement be waived. It does require the submittal of substantial evidence and the approval of the deputy director to determine that that spring is fully contained in order to apply for that component. And it's also important to note that the fully contained springs still need to comply with the numeric flow requirement at the compliance gauge. and the forbearance periods. So Section 4 of the Cannabis Cultivation is the Watershed Compliance Gauge Assignments. The policy establishes minimum monthly flows at the compliance gauges, as I mentioned. In the watershed areas where, without existing gauges, cannabis cultivators are assigned a compliance gauge for a different location in basically the same watershed or a nearby watershed. So it may be the cultivators downstream of a gauge, they may be assigned to an upstream gauge, or it may be that cannabis cultivators in a watershed that doesn't have a gauge in it and you're reporting to a gauge in a nearby watershed. During the diversion season, as I mentioned, the cannabis cultivators are required to check their assigned compliance gauge at least daily and prior to diverting to ensure that the flows are in the stream above the minimum flow requirement. There's water available to be diverted. And then compliance gauge assignments may be changed over time as more gauges are installed and more information is developed. We are looking to develop for the compliance gauge watershed assignment component. We're in the process of developing an online tool that will allow cannabis cultivators to enter in their address or select their diversion location based on kind of like using Google Map, Google Earth, and it will identify the compliance gauge assigned for that cannabis cultivator. So Section 5 is the planning and reporting section. And this specifies the plans and reports that are needed, such as the site management plans, erosion and sediment control plans, nitrogen management plans, site closure plans. And on these plans, there's more detail of these plans provided in the general order. The attachment B, Section 6 of Attachment A is the useful guidance documents, which provides links to helpful water quality facts and documents, and then Attachment B is the glossary of terms used in the policy. So now the staff report goes with the policy. It provides an overview of the cannabis policy regions. It provides background information on legislation and regulations. And it provides the background and rationale for the policy requirements, the in-stream flow and gauging requirements, the compliance gauging assignments, including the methodology used to assign those gauges, and the water quality anti-degradation analysis. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tim O'Brien to talk in more detail about the general order.
Good morning. I'm Tim O'Brien, the Senior Engineering Geologist with the Waste Discharge Requirements Permitting Unit at the Division of Water Quality here at the State Water Board. And we were tasked with developing the general waste discharge requirements to implement the principles and guidelines that Dan just described. It's primarily for outdoor cultivation activities, but it also addresses indoor cultivation. The order only addresses legal cultivation sites, and it's designed for protection of water quality. The order also recognizes that other permitting requirements may apply, but it doesn't implement those requirements. And if applicable, a water right will be required, but the order does not provide that water right. So why prepare a general order? Well, cannabis cultivation has grown exponentially, and it's often located in sensitive areas. Prop 215 initiated the legal cultivation activities in the state, and Prop 64 is expected to greatly increase that activity. It's been estimated that as many as 50,000 cannabis cultivation sites may exist in the site. And a California Department of Food and Agricultural survey in 2016 indicated that as many as 16,000 cannabis cultivation licenses would be sought. CDFA will begin issuing those cultivation licenses on January 1st, 2018, and the cultivation license application will require compliance with the Water Board's requirements. Many of the regional water boards will need to provide coverage for the cultivation activities, but they don't have an order in place. So the statewide order addresses that issue. This is a photograph, aerial photograph of cannabis cultivation activities. And if you were to take any one of these cultivation sites and consider it individually, it wouldn't be a very significant impact in all likelihood. But when you get a large number of these sites, then they can be significant. So this is an aerial photograph of two watersheds where cannabis cultivation sites were mapped. And you can see that there's quite a high density in these two watersheds. The other thing about cultivating cannabis in remote areas is you need to build a road to get to it. And so this is a photograph of a road constructed for cannabis access, cannabis cultivation site access. And you can see that this is a road that when winter rains fall, that there will be a lot of erosion and therefore a lot of sediment discharge to surface water bodies. So we developed the statewide order here, and we started with the two existing orders that are out there that were adopted in 2015. The North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board prepared a waiver of WDRs, and they've got about 765 enrollees under that order. And the Central Valley Regional Water Board prepared general waste discharge requirements, and they've got just under 660 enrollees. So we took what we thought were the best portions of those orders in developing the statewide order. The order that we developed requires coverage based on the threat to water quality, and we took a tiered approach based on the disturbed area of the cultivation activity and the risk, which is based on site-specific conditions. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Some dischargers, the small ones, will qualify for conditional exemptions. But all dischargers must comply with the applicable requirements in Attachment A of the Cannabis Cultivation Policy. So if you were to look at Attachment A in the policy and look at Attachment A of the General Order, it's the exact same document. They're duplicated exactly. This is just kind of an overview of the discharge classifications. I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail. But for non-commercial activity, we have a personal use exemption. So if you're less than 1,000 square feet of disturbed area and comply with the conditions, and it's a non-commercial activity, you don't need to register or enroll under the statewide general order. For small cultivators that are engaging in commercial activity, they'll need to register under the general order, and the limit is 2,000 square feet of disturbed area and comply with the conditions. And then the larger cultivation sites would be Tier 1, that's commercial activity. That's where they are disturbing between 2,000 square feet and 1 acre. And then the largest facilities that will be permitting are Tier 2 commercial activity, and that's where the disturbed area is greater than 1 acre. So the personal use exemption is exempt from the CDFA licensing requirements because it's not a commercial activity. And what we allow in the statewide general order is consistent with the law. It's recreational up to 6 plants per property parcel, or for medical marijuana up to 100 square feet per patient, or if you're a caregiver cultivating for multiple patients, you can cultivate for a maximum of 5 patients, so that's 500 square feet. Under the personal use exemption, there's a 1,000-foot maximum disturbed area, and it can only be located on a site with less than 20% slope. We want the cultivation to be in one location, has to comply with the setback requirements, all the applicable requirements of Attachment A. Coalitions and cooperatives cannot claim the exemption, and for the personal use exemption, there's no registration or enrollment required. Conditional exemption is the smallest of the commercial cultivators. They're producing commercial cannabis. They need a CDFA license. They can disturb up to 2,000 square feet and can be located on a 20% slope, no more than a 20% slope. Again, we want the cultivation area to be contiguous, comply with the setback requirements, implement all the requirements of Attachment A, and conditional exemption facilities are required to register under the general order. Tier 1 and Tier 2 are cultivators that are producing commercial cannabis, and they need a CDFA license. The tier determination is based upon the disturbed area. Tier 1 disturbs more than 2,000 square feet, less than 1 acre. Tier 2 disturbs more than 1 acre. For both Tier 1 or Tier 2, they have to comply with the setback requirements, implement the applicable requirements of Attachment A. And for Tier 1 and Tier 2, they have to enroll under the general order. They also have some additional reporting to do. Now, if you're a Tier 1 or Tier 2 discharger, we also evaluate the facility based on site-specific conditions. And we rate it as either low, moderate, or high risk. And the site-specific conditions we're primarily concerned with is the slope and the setback compliance. So if you're Tier 1 or Tier 2 and you're low risk, that means that no portion of your disturbed area is located on a slope greater than 30% and you comply with all the setback requirements. If you're moderate risk, any portion of the disturbed area is located on a slope greater than 30% and you comply with all the setback requirements. Or if you're high risk, then any portion of the disturbed area is located within the setback requirements. So we've developed an online internet-based application portal for dischargers to enroll, either register or enroll. So if you're the applicant, you go to the web address and you enter the information. The system will prompt you, ask you questions that you answer. You'll be answering water quality and water rights questions. And then the applicant self-certifies compliance with, here we're calling it the BPTC implementation schedule. It's really the attachment A where all those measures are required or are listed. And so the important thing here is that the applicant is providing the information and self-certifying that they're going to implement those, the requirements in attachment A. It's not the typical process where you submit a report to the Regional Water Board, the Regional Water Board reviews it, and then either approves it or says additional information is necessary. This is a more streamlined process. You go online, you provide the information, you self-certify that you're going to comply, and then you go on with the process. So that information is entered into what we call the survey wizard, and then it's later exported into a database. The State Water Board operates the California Integrated Water Quality System. When you submit the information, you'll get a notice of receipt back in email, and that email will tell you this is it, whether a fee is required, how much the fee is, and where you pay it. Then the applicant has 30 days to make that payment at the Regional Water Board office. That's where the information, the notice of receipt will tell you to pay the fee at the Regional Water Board. So you got 30 days to pay that fee. It's important that you pay it on time because the system won't just idly wait forever for you to pay the fee. You have to pay it, and even until you pay the fee, you won't get a notice that you'll be able to bring to CDFA for your cultivation license. Once the fee is paid, then that information will be entered into CWIX, and you'll get the discharger, the cannabis cultivator, will get a notice of applicability, and that will be the document that you'll need to go to CDFA to get your cultivation license. You'll also be informed of what technical reports are required to be submitted in the submittal schedule. And then from there, you're covered. You have your notice of applicability. You can begin your cultivation activities. And then the Regional Water Board staff will perform review of reports and inspections as needed. So as I mentioned, there is some reporting requirements. If you're conditionally exempt, there's only one report that you're going to have to submit, and that is if you decide to stop cultivating cannabis and you want to terminate coverage under the order, you have to submit a site closure report. And we want you to submit that 90 days prior to ending the cultivation activities. If you're Tier 1 or Tier 2, you have to submit reports based upon the threat to water quality. And those reports are due 90 days after you submit your application. So remember, we talked about the risk, low, moderate, or high. If you're low risk, you have to submit a site management plan, and someday, if you stop cultivating cannabis, a site closure plan. If you're moderate risk, you have the additional requirement to submit a site erosion sediment control plan. Now remember, moderate risk are those sites that are located on slopes greater than 30%. And if you're high risk, you have an additional report, disturbed area stabilization plan. Remember, those are the sites that are located within the setbacks included in the order. And then for larger cultivation sites that have more than a 1 acre cultivation area, they have an additional report that's a nitrogen management plan. That's so that you can show how you're using nitrogen in a way that's protective of water quality. Tier 1 and Tier 2 dischargers also have to do some monitoring and reporting. They have to submit an annual monitoring report. It will be due on March 1st each year. The attachment B of the general order contains the MRP, and it's important to keep in mind that based on site-specific conditions, the Regional Water Board Executive Officer can revise the MRP if there's some particular site condition of concern. So just to kind of go over the important things that we talked about, if you are a commercial cannabis cultivator, you're required to apply for registration or enrollment under the general order. If you're an existing enrollee in either the Region 1, the North Coast, or Region 5, Central Valley Regional Water Board orders, you're required to enroll under the statewide general order. So you have to transition to the statewide order. The transition is allowed, we allow transition period until July 1st, 2018. There will be some cultivators who were previously exempt under the Region 1 and Region 5 orders that will be required to register under the general order. But keep in mind that if you were one of those previously exempt cultivators, you wouldn't have a document that you could bring to CDFA to get your cannabis cultivation license. All the applications for coverage under the statewide general order will be online via the internet. Technical reports are due 90 days after your application is submitted, and self-monitoring reports are due annually March 1st. And now I'll hand it back over to Erin.
Thanks, Tim. So we've got one slide here on the small irrigation use registration program. The State Water Board is currently working on a statewide cannabis small irrigation and use registration that will be available after policy adoption, which is expected in late fall of this year. The idea is that existing water diverters should continue to file their appropriate water rights paperwork. So there are forms that can be filed right now until the cannabis registration program is available. This is only applying to surface water diverters. So to get a handle on what that looks like out there, how many people out there are cannabis cultivators? Okay. How many people out there are consultants for cannabis cultivators? Okay. This is a Sacramento meeting, so how many people are with a state, federal, probably not federal, but local agency? Okay, that's why we hold these Sacramento ones. And how many are just interested parties, maybe from the public? Great, so that's a good mix of people. This provision specifically applies to people who are diverting directly from a surface water body. I could say or subterranean stream, but I'm going to keep it simple, from a surface water body. So if you're not diverting from a surface water body, you wouldn't be coming in to get a small irrigation and use registration. But if you are currently diverting from a surface water body, you would need to come and get a small irrigation and use registration in order to continue to take water from the stream and use it during the forbearance period. Because basically, anyone who may be diverting under a riparian right, so maybe diverting year-round directly from a stream and using it directly during that forbearance period, will no longer be able to divert that water, and they'll need to come in and get that storage right so that they can take water during the wet season and then use it during the dry season. And Tim did a good job of describing that online portal that's going to be used to allow folks to apply for the general order. That online portal will also be asking questions related to source of water, so that if you do need a small irrigation and use registration, that you will get that at the same time. So you can apply for both of them at the same time. You'll get two separate bills, one for the general order, one for the small irrigation and use, but we're trying to do a streamlined one-stop shopping type of thing, and that's our goal with respect to that program. So reminders, comment deadline is noon on September 6th, so not right after Labor Day, but the Wednesday after Labor Day. And all of the information, all three documents are available on the Cannabis portal on the main webpage, as well as the presentation, so you can find all of those documents there. who do you want to contact after today if you have questions. If you have questions on the small irrigation use registration program, you can direct those to Sean McGuire and Roberto Cervantes. And Roberto is in the front of the room right there, raising his hand right now. So if you have questions, go see him. His staff's also here today too. And I think they're going to have a table outside if you want to talk to them about any of that. For general order, you know, Tim O'Brien just gave you an overview of the general order, and Kevin Porzio is his sidekick right there. So if you have questions about the general order, you want to go see Kevin. Dan Schultz is heading up the policy work, as well as some of his staff. Jeff Parks over there at the computer, Sam Boland right there. Peter was checking many of you in downstairs earlier today. So those are the folks you can talk to directly about the staff report or the policy itself. And then from the Office of Enforcement, Yvonne West, she's back there. If you have questions about what they've been doing, she's a great resource on all things cannabis. Cannabis cultivation. Sorry. And how many of you are signed up currently for our email subscription list? That's not enough hands. So if you're not signed up for our email subscription list, that's the best way to stay informed about our program. So please take a minute, sign up. You're only going to get emails when we're sending you out. We don't give your emails to other entities. So please sign up, and that way you'll know as quickly as anyone else does what we're proposing to do and how to stay informed. And with that, we are going to move into the question and answer phase of this meeting. So someone's going to grab that microphone, and if you have a question, if you could raise your hand and they'll bring you the microphone just to make sure folks that are on the web can participate and hear what's going on as well.
Hi, this question is probably for Tim. Tim, how is disturbed area defined in the general order?
Yeah, disturbed area is defined in the general order in the glossary, except for that it doesn't quite go under disturbed area. I think it's actually, the term is disturbed land. But it's kind of a performance standard, is if the soil has been disturbed in a way that increases the likelihood for turbid runoff, then that would be considered disturbed area. The other, that's one part of it. Then there's the other part of it, and that is that the area can also be stabilized. So just because something is disturbed doesn't mean that it's always disturbed. And so certain activities that are temporary can cause a discharger to be classified, for example, as a tier 2. But after that, some of the areas has been stabilized and may be able to be reclassified as a tier 1. So you would go to the regional water board to get that revised as needed.
I just want to point out on page 13 of the policy, it has a determination of total disturbed area that you might want to take a look at as well. Any other questions from folks? He's got another one, Anne-Marie.
How about growing on a slope? Can you define what that means in terms of, here's an example of my confusion. If you were to take a road and put it in the middle of a slope and I have a flat graded area and that's where my grow is that on, and let's just say the slope from the summit to the surface water is over 30%. Would I be growing on that slope per se, or are you looking at a more terraced situation for determining the slope description in terms of enrolling in the permit?
So slope is also defined in the order very carefully, and it's the horizontal run. Let's see, it's vertical over horizontal. So the vertical change over the horizontal run, and then times 100 turns into percent. But what we're concerned with is the slope that is measured over the disturbed area. So there may be situations in some cases where it depends on which way you measure it. You know, if you measure it in one direction, you get one slope. If you measure it in a different direction, you get a different number. And the order requires that the highest slope be reported as the slope for the determination of risk purposes, if you're tier 1 or tier 2, or if you're whether you comply with the conditions For example, in the conditional exemption, there's a slope limit.
And I would just add, it looks at the natural slope, not the disturbed slope.
So there was a July 1st date under the statute for a lot of people to file paperwork with the Division of Water Rights. It looks like, and I may be interpreting the presentation incorrectly, but that the small irrigation use registration program may kind of supersede that requirement for some diverters. So will people that failed to register by the July 1st deadline be penalized if they go to sign up for the small irrigation use registration program and it's learned that they didn't meet that July 1st deadline?
So what is permitted in SB 94 right now is that folks can file those documents and then use them as part of their process of applying to the California Department of Food and Agriculture for their license. So it's not a requirement that you come to the State Water Board by July 1, but more that if you would like to use that document as part of your licensing process, you were to submit it by July 1st of 2017.
I have an online question. I'm going to try to speak for him. This is from the City of Santa Cruz Water Department. I'm going to paraphrase here. Basically, they're asking if and how the proposed policies will enhance enforcement, and will the fees from the registration be applied to increase enforcement? And the concern is on the coastal streams. Again, this is coming from Santa Cruz, so the special status species and the illegal diversions that already exist on those streams.
So the Water Board has an existing program under the Office of Enforcement to address cannabis cultivation. We did receive resources in previous years for implementation of the Watershed Enforcement Team, which is a collaborative effort between the California Department of Food and Fish and Wildlife and the State Water Board. And so that effort will be continuing through implementation of the policy. That is a prioritized effort, and which stream systems and watersheds are targeted are based upon a variety of factors, including where we have sensitive resources, high density of grows, and other factors. And I'm going to actually ask Anne-Marie to take the microphone over to Yvonne West in case she wants to add anything.
Yeah, just in response to how this policy and this permit will enhance enforcement is, of course, the best managed, the requirements of this policy and these that are contained in, is it Appendix A now? Or Attachment A? Will become standards by which you have to cultivate and the cultivations have to adhere to, and could be the basis for enforcement if they're not complied with. So in that way, it does intersect with enforcement, but as Aaron stated, there's ongoing enforcement efforts and resources that are separate from this policy and this permitting process, and we have received resources. We've just recently have gotten resources that will allow us to extend down into the Santa Cruz area in the coming year, and no, we will not be, the permit fees do not directly go to any of the enforcement efforts.
And there's a second part to that question, or to this person's question as well, is asking how county codes will be affected by the statewide policy.
County codes are separate and distinct from state policies, so typically if there is some sort of conflict between local and state policy, the more stringent requirement would apply between the two of those.
Good morning. It's still morning. Most of the projects that we are doing are reuses of existing projects. For example, an old cotton facility on a very flat area. Will the local agency go ahead and put in our requirements in our conditions of approval for a conditional use permit application, or will we have to register separately if we don't have any of the slope or surface diversion issues?
You'll need to register separately to get a general order from the State Water Resources Control Board if you plan to cultivate for commercial purposes, because you'll need those waste discharge requirements, that enrollment under the general order in order to get your license from California Department of Food and Agriculture.
Thank you very much.
My question is, if one were to utilize grow bags, would that be considered disturbing the area?
Yeah, grow bags would be considered a disturbed area. We're aware that that's a common cultivation practice, and that plants oftentimes are spread at greater distances. Actually that's taken into account for the larger tier 2 facilities that have to submit a nitrogen management plan. We have a way to accommodate the potential use of grow bags.
Yeah, you indicated you were going to be receiving 16,000 applications. Is there any thought or indication from your end you might be restricting discharge permits, water acquisition permits in any of these watersheds?
So I'll speak preliminarily from the water diversion side of things. As part of our registration program, we do look at what water demand and availability is within a watershed, and to determine whether or not there is a potential problem with issuing ongoing diversion permits within a watershed. In this case, because we have a forbearance period and a limited diversion period with numeric and narrative flow requirements, right off the bat, there's likely to be less locations throughout the state that would be impacted by any sort of limitation on diversions, because we have already a forbearance period in place that says we're going to take water during the wet season when flows are at a certain level. And then from discharges, I don't know that there's any.
No, but from the coverage under the general order, we're not expecting to limit it in any way, except that, remember, during my presentation, I did say that the order recognizes that water rights may be required for cultivators. The general order doesn't address that, so that's a separate issue that'll need to be addressed through the water rights program.
As an existing regional water board permit, as we're transitioning into these, are we notifying the local cities and counties? So our ordinances that require that we have these permits right now, they understand the transitional time frame of July 1st or the July date?
That's a good point. We'll have to look at that, notifying local agencies that this transition is occurring.
Any other questions out there or online?
Hi, I have several questions. The first one is just to get some clarification. Several times it's been mentioned that the existing orders for the North Coast and the Central Valley, there's a transitioning period. Does that mean that those orders are now going to be terminated, they're invalid, and we just go off of the state board order?
Well, they're still valid, and they will be valid until the discharger or the cultivator transitions to the statewide general order. So you won't lose any coverage in that transition period.
And so the transition needs to occur by July 1 of 2018 under the existing policy and general order.
And then we'll just be going off of the state board order for all monitoring and reporting requirements. So that kind of leads me to my next question. There was application process for becoming a third party under the North Coast order. And so I wanted to know, what about that process? Is there a state board process? Are there groups that are going to form as far as coalitions?
Okay, so third-party representatives are recognized in the general order, and that's certainly something that we allow. But the concept of a coalition for cannabis cultivators under this general order does not exist. The general order does, though, allow for the possibility of a regional water board adopting what's called an Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, or ILRP, waste discharge requirement that may include the concept of coalitions. Our order doesn't include it. Down the road, maybe someday it will be. But none of the regions have an ILRP WDR that addresses cannabis cultivation at this point.
So there is a need for an ILRP cannabis WDR if you want to be a coalition group. You would want to be under that type of entity. Or
yeah, I'm not saying that there's a need for it. I'm just saying that there's an opportunity for it. If the regional water boards determine that that's what they want to do, then they can develop it. The thing that's important to remember is that whatever order is adopted has to be consistent with the principles and guidelines, the cannabis policy that the state water board will consider in October.
So this would be something that you're saying that would be considered in October? Or, I'm sorry, I was taking notes. I didn't catch the last comment.
Yeah, the concept of Irrigated Land Regulatory Program is kind of outside. It's different. It's not what we're talking about here. This order allows for third-party representatives, people who, for one reason or another, either don't have adequate computer resources or don't understand the application process. You can have someone, a representative, apply or represent you in matters related to the cannabis general order as the cultivator deems fit. This other concept of coalitions, it's not part of the statewide general order, and we're not going to include it. I'm fairly sure it's a large thing to try to change. So, but it is possible down the road if a regional water board wants to pursue that. I don't know if they will or not.
Okay, so that's something to discuss with the regions. Okay.
Yes, if there's adequate demand, then the regions may very well do that.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question online, but I also think it's worth reminding, I'm going back here real quick, since part of her question was about the timelines and what October was. This is, we're in a draft period right now. So everything we're talking about right now is proposed draft. That's why there's a comment period on here. So if you need to comment on some of these things, especially things that you see that may not work, now's the time to get these addressed. When we were mentioning October, that's when we're bringing this policy before the state water board to hopefully be adopted. So that's when the adoption hearing is. That's what October was. So the question this is from someone in the North Coast region, a consultant who's asking, what should cultivators do between now and when the general order is adopted? Should they continue to apply for the regional board's general order, or should they wait until the general order comes out?
Well, they can do either. If they need coverage under their region for their activities now, they need to get coverage under that order. But they will have to transition to the statewide general order, assuming that the order gets adopted by the state board.
I have another online question asking for some clarification on setback requirements and what happens if they're considered in a high-risk area, what plans would be needed to continue to operate in a high-risk area. And then a second part of this is what is considered large for submitting a nitrogen management plan.
Okay, so both of those things are described in the draft general order, including the setbacks. So if you have a disturbed area within the setbacks, then you have the disturbed area stabilization report. That's for the high-risk dischargers that I described earlier. And what was the other question, Jeff?
The second question is what might be required if they were in a high-risk area, if they wanted to continue to operate and they fell under high risk either because of setbacks
Right.
or other.
Okay, so the disturbed area stabilization plan gets submitted to the regional water board, and the regional water board will review that. If they can't stabilize the area by November 15th, then they will get some sort of a compliance schedule from the regional water board. So it's really kind of left to the regional water boards to determine whether they want to allow that. Some regional water boards may say that the activity isn't appropriate to be covered under the general order, and they may say, well, we're going to issue a site-specific waste discharge requirement. Oh, the nitrogen management plan. Okay, so as mentioned, that was described in the general order as well. It's tier 2 cultivators that have a cultivation area, not a disturbed area, but a cultivation area larger than 1 acre, have the requirement to submit a nitrogen management plan.
I have another question about the July 1st deadline this year. And the question is, if someone did not file an initial statement by July 1st, are they still eligible to apply for a small irrigation use registration?
So the question is if they didn't file a statement by July 1, whether or not they can come in and apply for a small irrigation and use registration when it becomes available. They can come in and apply for a small irrigation and use registration when it becomes available. And they should still turn in their statement.
Just to clarify that issue, again, so the July 1st, if you didn't file, you still can file, but the penalty to you is that you won't necessarily have your authorization ready by January 1st to go to CDFA. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Any more questions online or out there?
Those of us currently, we have both fall and our fall and spring reports that we are reporting regionally. So those are going to be replaced with just one annual report.
Right. So I just want to be clear that the statewide general order is a draft order at this point. If you're covered under a Region 1 or Region 5, North Coast or Central Valley, either waiver of WDRs or WDRs, and that has monitoring or technical report requirements, they are still due, and that's still enforceable. Don't ignore those things. You still have to go through all of that. But once the statewide general order is adopted, the order as it exists now, there is a monitoring and reporting program. That's just a one-time-a-year annual monitoring report submittal. If you have any questions about whether something is still due to a regional water board, the answer probably is yes. And if you have any questions, contact the regional water board for clarification. This draft order doesn't change any of those deliverable requirements.
Shala Varnock, Division of Water Quality. I just wanted to add clarification to what mentioned Tim, that even after the adoption for the groups that are currently enrolled on the Region 1 or Region 5 order, they would have to continue to comply with all the requirements of those orders until they transition to the statewide order. That would be basically a notice of applicability issued by the regional board.
Any other questions? Jeff? Going, gone. We'll all be here, so come talk to us or come talk to the people who raised the hands earlier if you have questions for anybody else. Thank you.